The Beast in the Fog. It was the winter of 1943, and the Eastern Front of World War II was gripped in a brutal stalemate. The bitter cold seeped into the soldiers' bones as they trudged through the snow, their faces pale and frostbitten, their boots caked in mud and ice. The Russian winter was unforgiving, but it wasn't just the cold that had the men on edge. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the line of fire, deep within the dense woods, something had begun stalking the soldiers. It wasn't just the distant sound of enemy artillery or the occasional scream of a fellow soldier succumbing to the frostbite. No, this was different. This was a creature. It had started as whispers among the troops. The Germans, always known for their terrifying stories and dark myths, had become unusually quiet. Where once they had mocked the Russians for their supposed superstitions, now they were oddly reluctant to go out at night. They spoke in hushed tones about a creature that roamed the darkened forest, an impossible beast that even their most hardened soldiers feared. The men had seen it themselves, the silhouette in the mist, the distorted shapes in the fog. But they didn't dare speak its name out loud, for fear of invoking it. It had been given many names, the Schattenwolf by some, Die Nebelbestie by others, but none truly understood what it was. Private Otto Muller had heard the stories, of course. Every soldier had. But he was a practical man, one who believed in logic and reason, not folklore and ghost stories. He had seen his share of hell on the battlefield, men torn apart by shrapnel, burned alive in their tanks, bodies frozen solid in the snow, but none of that prepared him for what was waiting in the trees. It was late one evening when Otto was standing watch. The fog was thick, rolling in from the nearby river like a living thing, swallowing up the forest and the battlefield beyond. There was something unsettling about the fog. It felt alive. The air was heavy, and even the distant sounds of battle seemed muffled, as if the fog itself was absorbing the sound. He was half asleep, his rifle slung over his shoulder, when he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the mist, something dark, something that didn't belong. A shadow, tall and unnatural, moving with an eerie fluidity through the trees. It seemed to glide, its movements too precise for an animal, too unnatural for a man. Otto's breath caught in his throat as the figure emerged from the fog. It was wrong. At first glance, it appeared human, tall, thin, hunched, its limbs long and unnaturally stretched. But then he saw its face, or what should have been its face. It was a grotesque mockery of human features. Its eyes were wide and black, like deep voids that seemed to consume light. Its skin was pale and translucent, hanging loosely from its bones, like someone who had been dead for years. The mouth? No, it was more like a gaping jaw that split the creature's face, filled with rows of jagged teeth that looked far too large for its head. The creature was not just haunting, it was death. Otto froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The rifle in his hands felt suddenly useless, as though the very air around him had grown thick with fear. He could hear it now, that terrible sound, a low, guttural growl, deep in the creature's throat, vibrating through the earth. It was the sound of something that had no place in this world. The creature's head snapped toward him, its eyes locking onto Otto's with an unnatural intensity. Otto's breath hitched as the creature slowly opened its mouth, the air around it crackling with an unseen energy. A shadow of something much darker seemed to move behind the creature, as if the fog itself was alive, wrapping around its form like a cloak. The creature's jaw parted wider, impossibly so, revealing rows of sharp teeth that gleamed white in the mist. A sickening, rattling hiss filled the air, and Otto felt a cold wave of terror crash over him, freezing him in place. But then, like a shift in the wind, the creature vanished, its form dissipating into the mist as if it had never been there. Otto blinked, his heart racing, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. But the fog didn't clear. No, instead, it seemed to thicken, pulling him in, urging him deeper into its suffocating embrace. He could hear something in the distance, a sound that chilled him to his core. It was faint at first, but growing louder, the sound of footsteps, slow and methodical, stepping through the wet ground. And then came the screams of soldiers, men who had been taken. The creature wasn't alone. It was surrounded by others. Figures emerged from the mist, more distorted shapes, their bodies shifting unnaturally, their eyes glowing in the dark. They moved with a predatory grace, hunting the soldiers with a savage, animalistic intent. Otto's mind raced. He could hear the sound of men running in panic, shouting orders, firing rifles, but it was all useless. The bullets couldn't stop the creatures. They moved too fast, too fluidly, as if they were made of shadow itself. Otto tried to retreat into the trees, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The fog had wrapped itself around him, thick and heavy. He could feel it closing in, the shadows creeping forward. Then, in the dead of night, everything went quiet. Otto awoke hours later, alone in the forest. The battlefield, once filled with soldiers and tanks, was now empty. The only remnants of life were the occasional scream or rustle in the trees. The fog had lifted, but the terror had not. The creatures were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The beast had come for them, and it had taken what it wanted. As the days passed, reports of strange disappearances continued to trickle back to command. Soldiers had gone missing in the fog, whole platoons, vanishing without a trace. Some said it was the Russians, others blamed the partisans. But Otto knew the truth. The creatures weren't human. They had been something older, something born from the very darkness of war itself. Somewhere in the forests of Eastern Europe, a creature lurked, waiting for the next soldier to fall victim to the fog, waiting for the next lost soul to wander too deep. And it would always be there, lurking in the mist.